Ladies and gentlemen, the Donner Prize for 2014, the winner, Dealing with Losers by Michael Trebilcock.
Well, let me say at the outset what is obvious, and that is this is a huge and indeed overwhelming honor for me to be the recipient of the Donner Book Prize for the best public policy book by a Canadian published in 2014. It's clearly one of the high points of my career and perhaps rewards longevity and persistence as much as excellence. Given the stellar contributions by the other three shortlisted contributions in this year's competition, I congratulate the other three shortlisted authors, but commiserate with them somewhat less strongly. I've been fortunate over my lengthy academic career, much of it spent proudly at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law as a founding member of the Law and Economics program at the law school, to have had numerous opportunities not only to research and write about topical issues of public policy, but to have been engaged in one capacity or another in endless government commissions, task forces, committees, and related initiatives with greater or lesser impact. As well, I've been privileged to be a consultant to major law firms and clients in many complex competition and regulatory matters. So in one capacity or another, I've been close to the Canadian public policy making process most of my career, and that has yielded on my part endless fascination, and I have to acknowledge sometimes exasperation with the policy-making process and the complex intersection of politics, economics, and law in this process. The book for which I've received the prize, Dealing with Losers, The Political Economy of Policy Transitions, focuses on an issue that I believe has received insufficient systematic attention in the policy reform process. And that is the appropriateness and indeed on occasion political imperative of adopting policy compromises that mitigate the transition costs faced by losers from the policy reform process who have made investments of one kind or another predicated on, and in many cases even deliberately induced, by the pre-reform set of policies, and quite justifiably see themselves as aggrieved by the change in the policy environment. So the issue of when and whether to mitigate the costs associated with these policy transitions is crucial, and it's not simply an issue of compensation, although it may sometimes be that, but also grandfathering of certain classes of parties who have made reliance investments on prior policies, phased implementation, postponed implementation. This issue is ubiquitous across the policy landscape, but I think it's not been seen as a systematic challenge for policymakers as it should. Lloyd George, who was the Liberal Prime Minister of Britain from 1916 to 1922, is once said to have advised, the most dangerous thing in the world is to try to leap a chasm in 2 jumps. I find this advice in many policy contexts to be unhelpful. I mean, it is, of course, true, unwise to try and leap a chasm in 2 jumps, but to try and leap a large chasm in 1 jump is often equally suicidal, compared to building out a bridge in stages across the chasm or working around the edges. So I begin the book, or motivate the book, with a striking example, a dramatic example of this issue. The long fight to end slavery, led by William Wilberforce amongst many others, culminated in Britain with the enactment of the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. This act made provision for a payment of £20 million, almost 40% of the British budget at that time, in compensation to plantation owners in many British colonies, about $21 billion in present-day value. Wilberforce and many other abolitionists accepted that compensation and phased abolition of emancipation was required to ensure implementation of this legislation, particularly by the House of Lords, where the plantation owners were strongly represented amongst the aristocracy. So that's the start of the book. I then turned to 7 detailed case studies of contemporary policy debates that I think raise similar issues. I won't go through them in detail, I'll just list them. Reforming public pension schemes in the light of increased life expectancy, which means increased drawings by retired people as they live longer, and declining fertility rates, which means there are fewer contributors to pay-as-you-go public pension schemes. An American case that's always intrigued and annoyed me, the U.S. home mortgage interest deduction, which is highly inefficient and overstimulating demand for housing and highly inequitable in favoring taxpayers in higher tax brackets. How on earth do we ever get, or how on earth do they ever get out of that? Trade liberalization is my third case, which I think is one of the under-celebrated success stories of post-war policy making, where gradualism, reciprocity, and reversibility have been key features of trade commitments that we've made to our trading partners, which have mitigated transition costs and managed opposition to trade liberalization. I then turned to agricultural supply management, which is a striking and unfortunate exception to these general trends of trade liberalization, where Canada today faces, I think, an increasingly challenging task of extricating itself from our supply management schemes, particularly in the case of the dairy supply management schemes, which our trading partners are increasingly insisting on as a quid pro quo for granting us trade concessions. I have a case study that turns to why liberalizing immigration policy has proven so much harder than liberalizing trade policy. Why is it harder for people to move across borders than goods? Now, Canada, I think, at least in the last few decades, has had an enviable policy, by and large, in maintaining liberal immigration flows, but many of you will recognize that this is a highly rancorous and divisive political issue currently in other countries, including the US and the EU. So I address what it is that constitute losers. Who are the losers from more liberal immigration policies, and what is it we might do to mitigate those losses? Finally, I turn to climate change policy, surely the greatest regulatory challenge of our time, on which our MC has written much more authoritatively than me, but where it's clear that sudden draconian changes in policy are simply politically unacceptable. So again, we're looking at how to phase in through time, and I would argue a graduated carbon tax or cap and trade equivalent, and imposing on imported goods a similar burden, so that we do not simply end up inducing migration of both carbon jobs and investment to countries that adopt more lenient policies. But in any event, here are contemporary examples where thinking systematically about how we cope with the transition costs are crucial to moving forward, because if we don't address these costs, the default option often is to make no progress at all, right? Simply the preservation or persistence of the status quo. Let me close by saying, in my career as an academic lawyer, got one interested very much in the intersection of law, politics, and economics. I have benefited enormously from an older generation of economists, some of whom are here, Grant Ryburn included, that I call a political economist. And at the University of Toronto, I knew many of these older scholars well, Ed Safarian, Doug Hartle, Albert Breton, John Dales, and of course, political economists further afield at Queen's, people like Tom Corshane, Robin Bodway, late Eddie West at Cowden, and so on. In the U.S., Anthony Downs, Mansur Olson, James Buchanan, Gordon Tallock, an older Douglas North, an older generation of political economists who have enormously influenced my thinking about these issues, but seem to be a disappearing breed, superseded by mathematicians, econometricians. I'm sorry, I didn't pronounce it, I think, and modelers, right? And I think this has diminished the economics profession, the loss of people like this. And I have been the beneficiary of an enormously rich legacy. Now, you might regard this lament for the passing of this older tradition of political economy scholars as a weak and self-interested case on my own behalf for academic dilettantism, pretending that I can see political patterns or political economy patterns across diverse policy domains, as this book claims. But if that's what it is, it's a weak and self-interested defense of academic dilettantism, I guess I plead guilty. I don't apologize for it, especially in the presence of our Master of Ceremonies tonight, who seems to me to embody this quality in one of its most striking forms. Dilettante, yeah. Like me. Let me just conclude with thanking a multitude of people who've supported my lengthy career. 7 great deans at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, 3 of whom, Rob Pritchard, Ron Daniels, and Ed Iacobucci, 2 of whom are here tonight, became close scholarly collaborators. A wonderfully stimulating group of academic colleagues at the law school and in the wider university community, an enormous network of professional relationships with judges, government officials, distinguished legal practitioners, and finally, the support and love of a wonderful family, 5 children, now 10 grandchildren, and my spouse and soulmate for 48 years, Jan Trebilcock. The pillar of our family was here tonight with 2 of our 5 children, Jim and Chris, and our daughter-in-law, Amber, representing the larger family. So thank you again for the great honor you have done me tonight.